Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming in today. Humanism is a philosophy informed by science, inspired by art, and motivated by compassion. Humanists strive to lead meaningful and ethical lives. We use reason and empathy to guide our decisions and actions. We live meaningful lives because we honor the fact that this is the only life of which we are certain. As humanists, we affirm the dignity and worth of all people. And now we'll move on to our member reading. Hank Robb.
Some of you may know that for a long time I've been pursuing a monistic approach to spirituality. And in that pursuit, I ran into a prayer by Reinhold Niebuhr, which seemed to have some good aspects, but needed a little fixing up. And so it is, may I willingly acknowledge life as I find it, as life is, was, or may be, even though I may not approve of what I find. Have wisdom to see what would be good to change or continue with. Act and willingly follow through, and be grateful for the opportunity to try to live my life as best I can. As you can see, I have left out acceptance because it seems that that word means approval and acknowledgement. We say things like, I cannot accept that, which really means I don't approve of it. Now, we can be ignorant, we can deny, we can grudgingly acknowledge, but what I invite us to seek is a willing acknowledgement of life as we find it, even though we may not approve of what we find. Wisdom is what allows us to act now and do things we may not prefer presently, but in the service of things we will later be glad we did or chose not to do. Getting the ball rolling is not the same as keeping it rolling, and doing that willingly rather than grudgingly makes a big difference. And we are the only beings that, as far as we know, are not living our lives as best we can, because we're the only beings who can have ends in view. No other beings that we know of make plans to do things a year from now. So we do have the ability to try to live our lives as best we can. And for that, I suggest we can be grateful. Thank you.
And now we're going to be moving on to the main topic for the day. Our topic today, why you should move to Uruguay. I would now like to introduce today's speaker, Professor Jeff Seward. Jeff taught primarily political science courses at Pacific University for 30 years before retiring just 2 years ago. He is a popular HGP speaker who has presented over the past several decades. His annual post-election programs are always especially informative. Jeff recently moved to Uruguay and is here today for a post-election review. This is my first time seeing him live. I've only watched him on YouTube, so I'm very excited to hear from him in person in the friendly house. Please, if everyone will give a warm welcome to Jeff.
So I wanted to start by asking a question. How many of you here, since the election, have had a reasonably serious conversation with your family or close friends about leaving the US and going to live in another country? Raise your hands. Not as many as I thought. How many of you think there's a reasonably good chance that you or your friends will actually follow through and do it? A couple. Oh. But not everybody. I think that's pretty typical. I left the country to move to Uruguay August 1st. I spent about a month in Brazil and a month in Argentina on my way before arriving in Montevideo, waiting for my goods to come by ship. I got to Montevideo in the middle of September, so I have about 3 months of actual experience as an expat to tell you about. But this wasn't the first time that I thought seriously about leaving the country. I lived in Germany for 3 years when I was a kid as a military dependent, and I lived in Brazil for 3 years as an adult doing research for my Ph.D. dissertation. So I previously had some real experience living abroad. In the late 1990s, my Peruvian wife, Maria, and I talked half seriously about retiring in Portugal. And we were both fluent in Portuguese because we'd met in Brazil. And when George Bush was reelected in 2004, my wife and I talked much more seriously about moving to Toulouse, France, where we had old friends. But while we were both fluent in English, Spanish, and Portuguese, our French wasn't very good. And both of us were still in mid-career and worried about whether we could really get satisfying jobs in France. And we had a 12-year-old daughter who just finished her first year in middle school and didn't know any French at all. Would it be fair to uproot her and force her through such a tough transition at such a complicated age? In the end, we gritted our teeth and soldiered on. But we talked in recent years even more seriously about moving to Uruguay. And when my wife passed away last year, I decided I would actually do it at the age of 76. I was guided, I think, by the spirit of a comment made by C.S. Lewis many years ago. C.S. Lewis said, "You're never too old to set another goal or to dream a new dream." As a kid, I moved around about every 3 years in an Air Force family, and I went to 2 elementary schools, 2 middle schools, 2 high schools, and eventually 6 universities. I have lived in 11 different states. It made me used to adjusting to new places and in some important senses, addicted to novelty. After 34 years in Portland, in the same job and the same house, the same wife and the same daughter, I decided I was ready for one more big adventure in my life, one more new dream. And I want to report that, like the man who jumped off the Empire State Building, who was asked as he passed the 50th floor on the way down how he was doing, my reply is, well, so far, so good. I've given several lectures here at HGP where I described the specific attractions of Uruguay and why I wanted to move there. Today, I thought instead to talk about the challenges of becoming an expat and about my reactions to my first 3 months in Uruguay. I've been thinking about and researching about Uruguay for about 10 years now. I gave a lecture here in 2015 called The Making of an Un-American, Why I Want to Move to Uruguay, but my wife won't let me. I've been reading their leading daily newspaper online almost that long. My wife and I visited the country twice before really getting serious about moving there. And I am fluent in Spanish, which eliminated one really big obstacle to taking the plunge. 10 years of research may be a little excessive, but I would definitely recommend doing a lot of research about a target country, visiting it for a significant period of time and not just as a tourist, and making a very serious effort to get at least a basic command of the language of your target country, or go to an English-speaking country. It was not a cheap decision. Montevideo has a cost of living about 30 to 40% less than Portland, but there were a lot of transitional expenses. It cost me almost $25,000 to ship most of my household goods to Montevideo. I had to pony up a $15,000 deposit to rent an apartment, 5 months rent plus a guarantee fee, and $12,000 to join a good medical plan because of my age. I paid a local British attorney $3,000 to guide me through all the bureaucracy involved in applying to become a permanent resident. I expected that the move might cost me about $50,000, but in the end, the total bill came to about $65,000. I think that's probably not too atypical of what it would cost to do this for a person. The best money I spent was on the immigration attorney I hired. Uruguay is very welcoming to immigrants, but the process is still dauntingly complex. and even being pretty comfortable in Spanish. But I am now an official permanent resident applicant, and in about a year, I will become a full-fledged permanent resident. I was really happy to have a local resident attorney who speaks fluent Spanish and English guide me. He's married to an Uruguayan woman and has lived there 20 years. His children have grown up there. The process involves acquiring half a dozen official documents from different offices or companies, all of which needs to happen in a particular order. You can't get this document until you get that document, etc. It took me over a month just to get a local bank account. And I was still tracking down documents just this past Friday that the attorney needed to complete some other bureaucratic process. But I am now a proud holder of an Uruguayan ID card, a local bank account, a bank debit card, a medical certificate that I am healthy enough to engage in sports, a golf club membership card, a soccer club membership card. My soccer club just won the National Soccer Club Championship for the third consecutive year. I have a cable TV contract, an internet service, and a mobile phone contract. This is my phone card. And I also have a bus card, which I haven't used because I walk everywhere or use Uber if it's a long ways away. And each of those cards required navigating some unfamiliar bureaucratic landscape of both public and private organizations. I had my first experience with my healthcare service a week ago Friday, and it was great. I called for an appointment about noon on Friday, 9 days ago, hoping that I could get an appointment before I left the next Thursday. I needed a form filled out by a doctor for part of a bureaucratic process. They said, sure, how about 8 o'clock tonight? This was in Spanish. I thought I didn't understand. Tonight? And they said, yeah, tonight. I said, where? Well, in the shopping center that's just a 10 minutes walk from my apartment and where I do all my grocery shopping. So I showed up at 8 o'clock and had to wait about an hour and 15 minutes to be seen. There was a copay, $4. I had to pay $12,000 to join this medical service, but it's the monthly fee is $85 and the copays are $4. The doctor was young, I would guess under 30, and she was very nice, informal, and professional, and had a pretty good English, which I much prefer for medical things because my Spanish medical vocabulary is pretty limited. I am still waiting to meet my first disagreeable Uruguayan. Everyone I have met so far has been intelligent, very nice, very honest and straightforward, and eagerly helpful. I tried to give a tip to a taxi driver in my first week there, and I was still getting adjusted to how much money is worth. A dollar is worth about 40 Uruguayan pesos. And this taxi fare was like 150 pesos, and I was trying to give him a tip of like 100 pesos. So I shouldn't have been. And he said he wouldn't take it. He said, no, that's too much. You shouldn't be giving a tip that large, because he could recognize I was a foreigner and new. And so I ended up giving him like 30 pesos or something, or 20 pesos. But where else in the world, if you go to New York, are you going to find a cab driver who tells you you're trying to give him too big a tip? But almost every week, I am still encountering some new bureaucratic issue that I don't automatically know how to deal with and have to do it in Spanish. This week, it is the monthly municipal tax bill associated with my apartment it's about $60, that is still in the name of the owners and that I needed to transfer to my name. I have people I can ask, but until I do, I haven't the slightest idea of the process required for me to do that. Can I do it online? How? Or do I have to make a phone call in Spanish or make an appearance in some local office in person? Where? For the things I've had to do on my own, about half of them I had to do at least 2 or 3 times because I went to the wrong place or didn't know about some preliminary thing I had to do or form I had to fill out before I could do the thing that I was trying to do. But I like Montevideo a lot, and I like the Uruguayan people very much. There's a terrific supermarket, a variety of 6 or 7 excellent restaurants, and a great shopping center, complete with 2 nice movie theaters, all within an easy walking distance of my apartment. I have a laundry service that picks up and delivers my dirty laundry for free and charges about $15 to wash and fold my bed linens, 8 or 10 days of underwear, half a dozen shirts, and 4 or 5 pairs of pants for $15 with free pickup and delivery. And I have a cleaning lady who will come for half a day once a month for about $9 an hour plus bus fare. I have a lovely view of the park across the street from my apartment and a walkway called the Rambla that runs along the river/ocean for about 10 miles. There's an abundance of entertainment in Montevideo. I've been to 2 excellent symphony orchestra concerts with seats about 10 rows from the stage for about $17. All the seats in the house are $17. It's half that if you're disabled. And I've been to a variety of other excellent shows and concerts and one terrific ballet, Prokofiev's Cinderella, all with very good seats for prices ranging from $25 to $45. I've seen Wicked and Gladiator 2 and The Substance in English with Spanish subtitles for about $9 a pop in the shopping center theaters, and I'm eagerly awaiting the arrival of Conclave. My cable TV package includes 7 ESPN channels, which air about 7 NFL football games a week. They do Thursday night football, 4 games on Sunday afternoon, Sunday night football, and Monday night football. Yeah. Plus lots of NBA basketball and a few Major League Baseball games a week during the season. Right now they're showing Colombian baseball in their winter league, plus coverage of all the major tennis and golf tournaments. I'm now pretty good at understanding Spanish language commentary on American sports. A quarterback sack is a captura, a capture, for example. And pretty good on History Channel documentaries narrated and dubbed in Spanish. And I have a couple of Uruguayan friends that I have very enjoyable lunches with from time to time. One of the outstanding political scientists from the National University, whom I first met on one of my visits to Uruguay years ago, and a young woman who spent a year at my university, Pacific University, as a Spanish language assistant a couple of years back, who I met here before I went down there. Once I am firmly settled in, I am still unpacking and putting away a lot of my household goods from Portland. I have a bed in a guest room that's about this high with blankets and sheets and clothes and miscellaneous junk. But once I get firmly settled in, I hope to make more friends through the university and my private golf club. The golf club has choral groups that meet regularly that I hope to become a part of, for example. The politics of Uruguay are progressive, stable, and civilized. What a concept. The Economist magazine rates Uruguay as the 6th most democratic country in the world. Ahead of it are most of the Scandinavian countries and a couple other places. The US on this list ranks 48th. Uruguay just completed a national election between a responsible, moderate, conservative coalition, imagine that supports the current government, and a responsible, moderate, progressive coalition that ended up winning the election and will return to power in March. The progressive coalition, the Frente Amplio, the Broad Front, governed for 15 years between 2004 and 2019 and carried out a whole series of progressive reforms that, for my money, made them the most successful, sustained progressive government in the world. I find that I am beginning to feel sufficiently Uruguayan to be very proud of our highly successful and civilized democracy. So all in all, as I said at the top, so far, so good. I am extremely happy with the decision to move to Montevideo and think I will end up being pretty deeply immersed in Uruguayan life. Someone once said, the only things in life you regret are the risks you didn't take. I am very happy that I will never have to live with the regret of not having made this leap. So I want to leave you all. I don't know why this is emotional for me. I didn't expect that. So I want to leave you all with a question that Alice poses to her guests at her garden party in Wonderland. Would you like an adventure now, or should we have our tea first? I don't think you should have to choose. Have your tea while you think it over, and then choose to have an adventure. But on to the less wonderful adventure the US is about to embark upon. The second administration of Donald J. Trump and the weird election that brought him there. What an election, huh? How did a majority of the American electorate choose a convicted felon facing even more serious felony indictments than the ones he got convicted for, a pathological liar who spouts ridiculous nonsense in almost every paragraph he utters, a public figure who displays almost complete ignorance about every significant problems facing the country, and suggests appalling or absurd proposals for almost every major issue, a criminal who tried to overthrow the Constitution to remain in power, and a president-elect who blithely nominates clowns and incompetents like Matt Gaetz, Pete Hegseth, Tulsi Gabbard, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to major public offices. By the way, in the wake of all these astonishingly bizarre nominations, his public approval ratings have gone up and not down. We don't even get to whine about the Electoral College this time because he won not an overwhelming, but a pretty decisive majority of the popular vote, especially if you set aside for a moment the huge Democratic majorities in California and New York. And he won a majority in every one of the 7 so-called swing states: Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada, all of which Joe Biden won in 2020. In this election, 53% of white women voted to restrict their reproductive rights. 21% of Black men voted to bring back stop and frisk. 36% of Latino women and 54% of Latino men voted to terrorize their friends and extended families with mass deportation and broken families. 51% of people with incomes below $100,000 and 44% of people in union households voted to give more tax cuts to rich people and to make it harder to form a union. 65% of white people without a college degree voted to abolish the Department of Education. And 54% of people within 20 years of retirement, ages 45 to 64, voted to undermine Social Security and Medicare. So what the hell happened? There are some general explanations that are certainly part of the answer. First of all over the world, incumbent governments have been defeated almost everywhere. The conservative government in Britain suffered a historically catastrophic defeat. The center-left government in Germany is losing state elections to the far-right neo-Nazi Alternative für Deutschland. The centrist government in France lost big in a recent election, and its current government just collapsed after a no-confidence vote in their parliament. The center-right governing party in Japan just lost its parliamentary majority for the first time in a couple of decades. Argentina's center-left party, defeated in a national election last year by a crazy libertarian outsider that was a complete unknown just a couple of years ago. The Romanian Supreme Court just canceled their presidential election because it had been deeply manipulated by Russian interference. And Justin Trudeau's center-left party, in what Donald Trump has started calling the great state of Canada, looks to be headed for a crushing defeat in the next elections there. The only incumbent government that managed to elect a successor that I can think of is Mexico, where the populist left-wing government managed to elect a successor who happens to be a Jewish woman So Mexico is Catholic Mexico, backward Mexico is electing a Jewish woman to be president. We're still looking for our first woman president. Machista Latin America has elected female presidents in Mexico, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and I think I'm leaving out someplace. Oh, Peru. But Mexico's the only place I can think of where the incumbent government managed to survive and elect a successor from the same party. Nearly everywhere, inflation and immigration were the big issues that cut against incumbent governments. So looking around the globe, although I know it is scant consolation, but the pretty narrow defeat suffered by the Democrats here was actually a pretty good outcome compared to electoral outcomes for incumbents almost everywhere else. But I want to knock down 3 explanations that are floating around about Trump's triumph that I think are just wrong, even though there is a certain kernel of truth to them. First of all, the Biden-Harris administration did not lose because the economy was bad. The US had the most successful recovery from the COVID pandemic of any country in the world. We had 4 years of economic growth, declining unemployment, declining inflation, resurgent manufacturing. There's not a country in the world that wouldn't jump at the chance to trade their economic record over the last 4 years for ours. There was a broad perception that the economy was very bad, but that was just false. In the last year or two, a majority of the public thought the economy was in recession when it wasn't, that inflation was getting worse when it was getting better, and that unemployment was rising when in fact it was declining to a 50-year low. More later about what was behind those false impressions of the state of the American economy. But there's no question that those perceptions were just wrong. Kamala did not lose because the American economy was bad. A second incorrect analysis is rooted in the reality that the working class, especially the white working class, but also a surprisingly large minority of the Latino and African American working class, voted for Trump and against Kamala. Bernie Sanders said recently that this was because the Democratic Party had abandoned the working class. This was also just flat out wrong. The Biden-Harris administration was the most pro-worker administration since at least Lyndon Johnson and maybe since Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. Not only did they have a great record on creating jobs, but average wages increased significantly faster than inflation, and the biggest gains were for lower paid workers. While despite his bluster, Trump presided over a decline in American manufacturing jobs. Manufacturing jobs made a pretty big comeback in the last 4 years during a Democratic administration. Under Biden, the National Labor Relations Board became much more pro-union than it had been. The Biden administration passed rules to limit non-compete clauses in ordinary workers' contracts and expanded by a lot the number of workers who would qualify to get overtime pay. And Joe Biden became the first president in US history to walk a picket line in support of labor union strike. And despite the narrowest of margins in the Congress, Biden was able to pass 3 major pieces of legislation: the Inflation Reduction Act, which is really a climate change act, mainly, the Semiconductor Chips Promotion Bill, and a big infrastructure package, all of which were very good news for American workers. The Biden administration was radically more pro-worker than the first Trump administration was, and certainly more pro-worker than the second Trump administration is likely to be. The depressing reality is that the Democrats hadn't abandoned the working class, but the working class has abandoned the Democratic Party. And it seems clear to me this was not because the working class was economically neglected. A third explanation is that the Kamala campaign was too liberal, too woke, but her campaign actually was very centrist. And she studiously avoided emphasizing the prospect of being the first female president and the first woman of color to become president. This was in stark contrast to Hillary Clinton, who made a big deal about, becoming the first female president. Kamala, tried to stay away from that. She spent much of the campaign celebrating the support of conservative Republicans like Dick and Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger, and a new list every week of prominent Republican veterans of the Bush administration, the Reagan administration, and even the first Trump administration. It's just not true that Kamala ran an ultra-liberal campaign. So why did the working class, especially working class men, turn their backs on the Democratic Party? I believe the answer lies in the striking difference in the votes of Americans who have some college education and those who never got beyond high school. Increasingly, a majority of people in these two groups live in separate realities. And those separate realities are related, to my mind, to two big factors. First of all, the progressive left since the 1960s has strongly supported an expansion of rights and social inclusion for previously excluded groups, racial minorities, women, gays and lesbians, trans people, immigrants. And there's been a prolonged and deep intellectual exploration of the reality of racism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, and xenophobia. And that exploration has taken place most profoundly on university campuses, and then spread out to college-educated elites in the mass media, the entertainment industry, and even the upper reaches of at least part of the business community. And has certainly spread out into the judicial system of the country. This has put people exposed to universities at odds with the common sense of the majority of Americans who have not been directly exposed to campus culture. The sad and understandable reality is that traditional American common sense, and this would be true around the world for that matter, American common sense is deeply racist, misogynist, homophobic, transphobic, and xenophobic. This is not because most Americans are bad people. They haven't made some moral choice to become prejudiced. It's simply because those prejudices have deep historical roots going back hundreds and in some cases thousands of years, and they aren't transcended without a long process of exploration and reflection. These prejudices have many layers to them, and intellectual elites over the last 60 years have been painstakingly peeling back those layers and developing a deeper understanding of the complexity and subtlety of those prejudices and the radical implications for how extensive the process must be to overcome them at the individual level or at the social level. And as that process has gone on, with each successive layer of prejudice being peeled back, these cultural elites have gotten farther and farther away from the common sense of the general population, which has not been going through a similar process of self-examination. So perceptions of reality that now seem self-evident to those who have gone through this process seem completely divorced from the common sense of the great majority of people who have not gone through this process. For a simple example of this process, look at the example of the evolving racial attitudes of Abraham Lincoln. In the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates, in which Lincoln condemned the evils of slavery and opposed its extension outside the South, Lincoln nevertheless did not yet advocate abolition in the slave-owning states. Moreover, he was at pains to emphasize that while he was opposed to slavery, he did not believe in granting social equality to former slaves. They certainly shouldn't be allowed to vote. He's quite explicit about this in these debates, because he had to deal in part with his own prejudices and the prejudices of his audiences. Deep into the Civil War, Lincoln met with a group of Black leaders in the White House and shocked them by suggesting that after the slaves were freed, it was obvious that whites and blacks would have a hard time living together and blacks should remove themselves back to Africa. That was still the level of Lincoln's common sense, like in 1863. I mean, about the same time he was issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. By the end of the war, Lincoln's views had evolved further, and he supported complete abolition, and voting rights, at least for Black veterans and more intelligent Black citizens. That position previously seemed almost crazy to him and to most white Americans, and would have been politically suicidal when he was running for the Senate against Stephen A. Douglas less than 10 years before. But that relatively more enlightened view ultimately failed to carry the day against the common sense of most Americans. White Northerners, within 10 years of the end of the Civil War, had grown tired of defending the civil rights of Blacks in the South during Reconstruction, and white Southerners had never become reconciled to full civil rights for the ex-slaves. So Reconstruction was ended, and the white South gradually constructed the racist terrorist regime of Jim Crow segregation, which to them seemed like the epitome of common sense. As late as the 1950s, William F. Buckley was defending the refusal to grant voting rights to Black people in the South because it was necessary to preserve civilization, and they weren't yet capable of exercising the vote responsibly. That was his common sense growing up as a rich person in Virginia. It is good to remember that in the mid-60s, when the Supreme Court in Loving versus Virginia declared laws against interracial marriage unconstitutional, a large majority of Americans were still strongly opposed to interracial marriage. And a not insignificant minority of Americans are still opposed to interracial marriage. Similarly to this story I'm telling about Lincoln and Reconstruction and the South, in the last 60 years or so, the ever more sophisticated analyses of the prejudices against the formerly excluded has moved farther and farther away from the common sense of most Americans and seems out and out crazy to at least a large minority and maybe a majority of the public. Hence the popular public reaction against woke policies of all sorts. Precisely because liberal cultural elites have taken the fundamental rights of excluded groups ever more seriously, and therefore have pursued ever more radical policies to secure those rights, they have created an ever bigger gap between their enlightened views and the still deeply prejudiced common sense of the non-college educated majority. And even the common sense of many people who pass through universities without really engaging with the increasingly radical analysis of prejudice of all sorts that was going on largely in the social sciences and the humanities. This gap is correctly attributed to the views of liberals and progressives, so that even if those sorts of views weren't at all emphasized in Kamala Harris's campaign or the campaigns of other Democratic candidates, the public correctly identifies these crazy assaults on common sense with policies that have had the support of liberal courts and liberal office holders in charge of major institutions. Men in general, including a surprisingly large segment of young men, for example, feel demonized by what I regard as a fundamentally correct critique of toxic masculinity. College populations are now over 60% women. More and more women have become deeply influenced by increasingly radical feminist ideas about how women's rights should be respected and expanded, while a relatively small segment of men have been engaged in that evolution of culture. And so many of them don't understand why women have become so damn difficult to connect with. White people have come to believe in the majority, and there's data about this, that white people face more discrimination than Black people do, against all empirical evidence. And they deeply resent the implication that their resistance to what seemed to them extreme anti-racist policies means that they are somehow racists. For them, you were only racist if you were actively engaged in shouting out the N-word and lynching Blacks from trees, because they still largely have only a very basic understanding of the deeply embedded character of racism and all the various layers that are involved in it, et cetera, et cetera. So the first big factor is this growing gap between traditional common sense and the increasingly radical activism against prejudice by a minority of cultural elites. The second factor is that the sense that sophisticated analyses of prejudice are sort of crazy is that the non-college educated population has also, to a tremendous degree, escaped from the cultural influence of professional journalism, academic expertise, or professional expertise of any kind. The cultural dominance of educational expertise has essentially collapsed, and non-college educated working class people rely on completely unprofessional sources of information and opinion, like getting their news from Facebook or Twitter, now X, or other social media, or Fox News, or conservative talk radio. This sort of media is just full of lies, conspiracy theories, and nonsense, and is almost completely devoid of any serious fact-checking or any serious standards about how to arrive at reliable facts. This makes it possible for Donald Trump to lie about almost everything with no social or political consequences. Social media and right-wing media sources like Fox News and right-wing radio talk shows repeat and magnify those lies in ways that reinforce prejudiced common sense. Attempts to combat this sort of lying are then easily categorized as elitist lies, trying to confuse and mislead ordinary people. So in this campaign, Trump was able to get away with ridiculous lies like the following. One, there's a massive increase in undocumented immigration, even though it has actually slowed significantly in the last year or so. Two, foreign countries are emptying their prisons and mental hospitals so that most of these immigrants are criminals and mental defectives, not to mention carriers of dread diseases. Three, as a result, there's a massive crime wave all over America being carried out by these deranged and criminal immigrants. I wish I were exaggerating the way he talks about this, but four, crime rates in major cities are skyrocketing, even though in fact they have been declining sharply for a couple of decades. Five, these deranged and criminal immigrants have completely taken over many communities like Springfield, Ohio, and Aurora, Colorado, and they are eating the dogs and eating the cats. Six, tariffs produce massive revenue that is paid for by foreign countries and not by American consumers. Seven, the 2020 election was stolen, and the January 6th rioters were peaceful protesters who are now political hostages being held unjustly in prison and deserve pardons. Eight, the indictments against Trump for serious felonies are all trumped up charges because Trump has not done anything wrong, and the prosecutors who have brought these indictments are politically motivated criminals who are the ones who should go to jail. Nine, efforts to combat racism are themselves racist and are damaging young people by making them hate their country. 10, inflation is out of control and getting worse all the time, but Trump's policies will somehow magically roll back grocery prices. And 11, climate change. The climate change advocates, this is the lie, are claiming that in the next 400 years, sea levels will rise an eighth of an inch. And this is going to actually create more oceanfront property for everybody. This is not just one time he has said this. This is a standard part of his stump speech. And I could go on because almost every paragraph out of Trump's mouth is full of lies that are then validated by irresponsible media and widely believed by Trump followers. The sad reality is that perhaps a majority of non-college educated voters and a not insignificant minority of college educated voters are living in a fact-free alternative reality. This hardens the gap between the sophisticated defenses of the fundamental rights of previously excluded minorities and the common sense of the great majority of people who have never been forced to look seriously at their own prejudices. This reality has led a lot of political analysts who want to help the Democratic Party recover its ability to win elections to say that, one, they should emphasize economic populism to win back lower class voters, and or two, back off of radically woke viewpoints and policies that alienate working class voters. If my analysis is at all correct, though, while I support a more populist economic message by Democrats, I don't think that will make much of a difference because working class voters are not voting against Democrats because of their economic policies, but because of opposition to cultural viewpoints and policies that seem like crazy violations of ordinary common sense. And the only way to back off progressive cultural stances is to suggest that Democrats should turn their backs on the legitimate claims of previously excluded groups. Just which excluded group should have their rights rolled back? Should we compromise on these evolving rights and allow traditionalists to restore Jim Crow style discrimination against racial minorities, women, LGBTQ people, immigrants? Wouldn't that be the modern equivalent of ending Reconstruction and allowing conservative traditionalists to force all of these excluded groups back into their respective closets? Should we accept the proposition that it is illegitimate to try to get the population at large to reflect deeply and look clearly at their inherited, deeply prejudiced common sense? So I'm left with a very pessimistic analysis. Culturally progressive elites are likely to grow even farther away from the common sense of non-elites, and non-elites are likely to live more and more as they deepen their resentment of being called ignorant racists and homophobes and so forth, are likely to live more and more in an alternative fact-free reality constructed by irresponsible social media and right-wing broadcast networks that reinforce their unexamined common sense and strengthen their defenses against any outside challenge to their prejudices. Which is also why I am very happy to now be living in Uruguay, where the great majority of the population seems to have accepted progressive reforms, including legalization of abortion, legalization of gay marriage, legalization of adoption of children by gay couples, the right of trans people to change their gender assignment on official documents, legalization of marijuana, et cetera, where the great majority of the population seems to have accepted progressive reform, expanding the rights of previously excluded minorities, where the electorate has just voted to return to power the progressive coalition that put those progressive reforms in place, and where no significant segment of the population seems to be living in a fact-free alternate reality. Questions?
All right, so we've got 4 questions so far in the Friendly House. Let's start with online, though. Oh, 5 now in Friendly House. Let's start with online. Let's go to Todd. Please start us off.
Hello, Todd.
Hey, Jeff, great to see you. Great to see you happy. Excellent presentation as always. I'll save the macro questions for others and just ask a personal question. How are they doing with the ramps now in Uruguay?
I've been looking, at that since you asked those questions the last time I was here. And like apartment buildings tend to have a ramp somewhere. You might have to go into the garage and then to an elevator. But public buildings, the ramps are pretty slim. And as I reported last time, a lot of sidewalks in Montevideo are in really bad shape. And so they aren't very friendly to wheelchairs or people needing other kinds of assisted mobility.
Well, others at the Friendly House know this, but my response to the Trump administration is to live in every state 1 week at a time next year. EscapePortlandBubble.com.
Excellent. Thanks for that plug, Todd. We are very excited to follow your journey on that. Let's go to the next question. Al, I think you came in next. Please unmute for us.
Yeah, Jeff, great discussion you gave us on the election. I agree pretty much with what you said about what happened, but I think I have a difference of opinion about why it happened, and I'd like you to comment on that. Well, basically, I was writing letters to try to bring out Harris voters by hand, which has a success rate of about 1 in 500 to get people to the poll, and with it, that's just so ineffective. And I'm going against. We didn't have technology on our side, and we didn't have the big institutions like the KGB and the GRU and all those other things in Russia. We didn't have Facebook on our side. We didn't have social media on our side very well. We were just fighting the last war with the last war's weapons, and we were just really overwhelmed by the waves of change.
Yeah, well, we did have $1 billion that they raised. I've read some analyses that say, well, the Democrats have to learn how to use social media as effectively as conservatives. I'm not quite sure how you do that. Does that mean that we need a bunch of left-wing social media stuff that spreads left-wing lies? Have any of you read the book Nexus by the author of Sapiens and so forth? He talks about how, advances in the spread of information, people naively think is going to lead to greater acceptance of truth. The more information, the more likely the marketplace of ideas will drive people towards truth. He says that ain't true. Lots of expansions of information networks spread gobbledygook and nonsense and lies and prejudice. And he sort of says that's the situation that we're sort of in now, where information networks that used to provide reasonably reliable information that everybody sort of agreed as a basis for conversation has disappeared. And so you've got a huge outflow of information, most of which has nothing to do with truth seeking. And I don't know how you get that genie back in the bottle. People say, well, we need a left-wing Joe Rogan. Well, there have been attempts to do that actually, and they just collapsed. There wasn't an audience for left-wing talk radio, for example. MSNBC, which has been, for me, a bastion of progressive commentary that I think is pretty fact-based. I think those people are pretty conscientious about not just spouting nonsense. Its ratings have fallen by about 50% since the election. They've just collapsed. And CNN's has too. I don't think we've seen the crest of the wave of people relying on bullshit sources of information. I think that's going to get worse before it gets better. And I don't quite see how to fix that. And I don't quite know why that doesn't seem to be true in Uruguay. I think it may be in part that Uruguayans haven't been as traditionalist. It's a largely unchurched population. There's not any big religious fundamentalist movement. They've had strong anti-religious secular political culture for the last 100 years or so. I think that's part of why they're less susceptible to just nonsense on social media. I mean, they have access to all this social media, but it doesn't seem to have infected their politics and their society the way it has here or in Europe, for that matter. I don't know if you followed this thing in Romania, but the Russians and others just flooded social media and TikTok especially in support of a candidate nobody had ever heard of, who's this right-wing pro-Russian nut who suddenly emerged and finished first in the first round of presidential elections. He had like 22% of the vote, and that was more than anybody else. And so they had a runoff, and 2 days before the runoff election was supposed to happen, the Romanian Supreme Court, after having investigated the influence of Russia in this social media campaign, canceled the election, said we're going to start over again because it had been so completely corrupted by Russian-influenced social media.
Gretchen asked, what about the safety and equality of women in Uruguay? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, I'd say overall it's pretty good, but like everywhere in the world, there's a serious problem with femicide, right? With women being murdered, especially by people close to them, by husbands and boyfriends and things like that. It's not worse than it is elsewhere, but it's an issue, and it's, you know, there are campaigns about it and efforts to try and reduce it. Montevideo itself seems like a pretty safe city. There's a fairly high murder rate in Uruguay, but it tends to be gang and drug related out in poor neighborhoods on the periphery of the city and so forth. I walk around all the time at night in Montevideo and never see any incidents that worry me, and haven't had any confrontation. When I lived in Rio, I had to about every 2 weeks, I had to fend off a pickpocket. I got to be really good at identifying prospective pickpockets. I haven't had a single incident that looked like that at all in Montevideo. Montevideo, at least the areas that I frequent, feels very safe. But I'm a big, tall male, so I don't know quite what the experience of a woman wandering around at night the way I do would be.
All right. Last question online for right now. And then if we have time, we'll come back for more on the Zoom, but we have now 7 in the friendly house. So Hank, can you please take us home online, and then we'll switch to in the friendly house.
Yes, it seems to me that many years ago, the Republican Party began picking up the white citizens' councils, etc. Why is it over that period of 50 years we see Trump as someone who has taken over the Republican Party rather than is the final fruition of years moving in that direction?
I agree with you. You know, this process I was describing of progressives moving away from the common sense of Americans, I would say one of the big pieces of that were the civil rights laws in the early 60s. And Lyndon Johnson, after they passed the I don't know if it was the Civil Rights Law or the Voting Rights Act, one of the two or both, turned to one of his aides and said, you know, we've just lost the South for the generations. And he was right. The racist Democratic white vote in the South switched over to the Republican Party. And it took a few elections, but not very many. I mean, it happened within the space of 6 or 8 years. And so you now have a solidly Republican South that's based on racist white voters who have not, to this day, become reconciled to the Civil Rights Acts of the early 60s. And then that expanded out to the same sort of issues with respect to the women's movement and the gay rights movement and trans movement and treatment of immigrants.
But they're the party of Lincoln.
And they've got about the same attitudes that Lincoln had during the Lincoln-Douglas debates. That's how far they've gotten with the Lincoln Party.
I don't imagine you have solutions, but one example occurred to me of something that I think we all would think is a really good thing that they feel threatened by, and that would be free college education. They would be worried that we're going to be trying to turn their children into liberal elites.
Absolutely. You know, the surveys show that the public's confidence in universities has collapsed. You know, 15, 20 years ago, like 65% of the public said they had high confidence in universities, and now it's 35%. When I was teaching at Pacific, especially when I first got there, there were a lot of, seemed like this was less true later, the student body sort of moved left while I was there, but there were a lot of evangelical Christian students. And we had a course called Western Civ, and we taught Plato and Aristotle and Greek tragedies and stuff about the Bible and this and that. And among the Christian groups on campus, this course taught by all these liberal professors was called Satanism 101. And I had more than one conversation with students who told me that they'd been warned by their pastors back home when they were headed off to college to be wary of, satanic influences coming from progressive professors. So, and I think that's more now. Now there's a whole movement about that that you're going to be intimidated if you're a conservative on a college campus. And I think there's some truth to that, but it means that conservative cultural institutions are building up prospective students' defenses against paying attention to left-wing progressive views about race and so forth. And in some places, they're passing laws. In Florida, they passed this law that said it's illegal to teach anything about race in the public schools that would make students uncomfortable. Or in other words, don't teach anything serious about race in the public schools. I think I mentioned this once before. Our dean at Pacific University a year or two ago said she'd gotten a call from a prospective parent who said, I was thinking of sending our child to Pacific, but we want to know, is anybody there teaching critical race theory? And she said, well, a few people are. It's a respectable sort of a thing. I don't know if that student ended up enrolling, but students are coming in and they're getting support from their churches, from their families, from conservative groups to tune out progressive messages that are coming from faculty at universities.
Number two.
I was going to ask you about the interaction between the Portuguese language, official language in Brazil, to the north and Spanish. But when you mentioned the evidence of crime and violence, makes me think about an issue in this country I'm very worried about, what I call the gun culture, and how the obvious need for more control over guns, like so-called slightly modified military rifles, is so obviously needed by us. And I'm wondering, what is there a gun culture in Uruguay also?
I think there are a reasonable amount of guns. They're not outlawed. In all the time I've been reading about and studying Uruguay, I don't recall there ever was a case of a mass shooting. The Uruguayans tend to kill themselves one at a time. And they're, it's like drug deal gone bad, or a boyfriend killing his girlfriend, or, people getting in a fight outside a bar or something. So there's not these sort of crazy lunatics that are getting, I don't think private citizens can have an assault rifle. I don't think that's legal. I don't remember ever reading about that being an issue. So, I mean, the violent crime in Uruguay looks more like used to in the United States than what it looks like now. But the number of people killed by guns is not nearly what it is here. I mean, no place is it nearly as much as it is here. What was the statistic I read the other day about? I don't remember. There's something about the number of people killed by guns here compared to something else. It was just, I know what it was. It was that the number of people killed by gun violence, the proportion of our population, is significantly higher than the number of people who are dying by guns in Haiti now, where these criminal gangs are in control of half the city and are roaming around and killing people. And it was more than, it was a whole series of places that are full of apparently violence that aren't killing nearly as many people with guns as we are in the supposedly civilized United States.
All right, number three.
You mentioned that Uruguay is very welcoming to foreigners and to what's the status of like indigenous people in Uruguay and the relationship to the government?
There wasn't a dense population of indigenous people in the original settlement. There was nothing like the Inca civilization or the Aztec civilization or the Mayan civilization. It was, nomadic bands and so forth. And as in Argentina, a lot of the native peoples got exterminated in the late 19th century. You know, about the same time we were finishing off our Indian wars here in the United States. And the indigenous population largely just was absorbed into the rest of the population. So there's not really a significant indigenous population that's of any social or political consequence. The Black population is about 8%, but there was never widespread slavery in Uruguay. That was not part of the colonial economy. And Uruguay was kind of a real backwater in the colonial era, so it didn't institutionalize that. So there's racist issues with respect to the Black population, but there's not the residue of slavery or legal segregation or things like that there. I wanted to go to the question that he was going to ask and didn't ask about Portuguese and Spanish, because that's near and dear to my heart, because I learned Portuguese first and then learned Spanish later. And my wife's family all came here from Peru, but a lot of them had moved to Brazil and ended up marrying Brazilians. And so they're all here in Portland. And I would go over to that house and I'd have to speak Portuguese to these people and Spanish to these people. And after about an hour, I just had a hopeless Portuñol. and my Portuguese kept getting contaminated by my Spanish. Now, I was pretty pleased in the month I spent in Portugal. My Portuguese held up pretty well. It was better than I expected it to be. But now that I've been immersed in Spanish so much for three months, I think if I go back to Brazil, I'll have Portuñol again, but it'll be my Spanish invading my Portuguese, not my Portuguese invading my Spanish. Well, I think the Brazilians have an easier time understanding Spanish than the Spanish-speaking people have understanding Portuguese. If you see them written, they're very similar. And that's how I first decided to start learning Spanish. I was in Brazil living in Portuguese, and I was interested in what was going on in Argentina, and they were selling the Argentine newspapers in the newsstands in Rio. And so I picked up a couple of them and started reading. I said, wow, I can basically read this. I'm getting 80% of this, and I don't know Spanish, I thought. And so the transition from going to one to the other is pretty easy. My wife, who grew up knowing no Portuguese and was a native Spanish speaker, went to Brazil to study computer science in a graduate program. And she didn't take any Portuguese lessons before she went. She was amazingly good at languages. She just went and started learning Portuguese and had no trouble going through this graduate program in computer science in Portuguese. And her Portuguese was great. My Portuguese got to be very good, but it was never as good as hers was. So going from one to the other is a pretty easy transition if you have any language adeptness at all.
Right.
In the north of Uruguay, I understand, along the border with Brazil, people speak Portuñol, basically. And on the other side of the border, it's sort of that way too. The southern Brazil, close to the Uruguay and Argentine borders, Paraguay borders, tend to speak Portuñol.
I understand that oil exploitation is relatively new in Uruguay, and I'm wondering if you are concerned about U.S. meddling in, like we have in just about all of the oil countries. U.S. meddling. Are you concerned about that?
No, not really. They haven't shown a lot of interest. They've discovered some promising offshore sites for oil exploration, but they haven't really explored them yet. I read something just recently, a couple of weeks ago, about negotiations with oil companies to explore these things and so forth. Uruguay's got a very good environmental record. And so I think they want to exploit this oil, which in itself is not a good thing. It'll contribute to global warming to do it. But I think they'll probably do it in as good a way as it can be done. That's been there. The big contribution that Uruguay is making to global warming is they have 4 cows for every person. That's their primary industry. And cows give off a tremendous amount of methane. And that's never going to change. And, I don't know if there's ever going to be a technological solution to the methane coming off of cows. But they're energy independent almost now, and they had a lot of hydropower. They don't have any nuclear power. They've gone in heavy for solar and wind power and biomass power, and they're actually exporting energy to their neighbors now. So aside from the cow methane problem, they've been really progressive and have accomplished a ton in environmental stuff.
Over the years, with you and your family, you consider going to many different places for your residence. And now you decided in Uruguay. What was your criteria for all these decisions, and why did you end up settling here? It's usually not one place where most Americans think of off the top of their head of a place to retire.
It's not that Americans think of even at the bottom of their head. You know, when I tell people I'm moving to Uruguay or something, they say, well, how is Ecuador anyway? You know, sort of like Iowa and Idaho. Nobody's ever heard of it. I was a Latin American specialist, and I didn't know anything about Uruguay because it's a small little country. It's 3.5 million people. I wanted to study the big, important countries like Brazil and Argentina and Mexico and Cuba, even though it's a small country, but it was significant, and Peru and so forth. I was on a search committee for a Latin Americanist when I was a graduate student at Stanford. And one of the best candidates was a guy who'd written his dissertation on Uruguay and eventually wrote a pretty good book about Uruguay. This was way back in the 80s. And we discussed this candidate and we said, well, you know, this guy really looks good and everything, but why do we want our only Latin American specialist to be a specialist on Uruguay? You know, nobody wants to know about Uruguay. The political aspects of it really appealed to me. I first saw a travel log on TV about it. My wife and I like to watch these travel shows, and they were showing it. And I said, gee, that looks like a nice place. Why don't we go visit? And so we did. And I started doing research and saying, well, the climate's really nice, and the geography's really neat, and the culture seems pretty good. Must be something wrong. I kept looking for bad things about Uruguay, and everything I looked into, they were really good on. They were good on the environment. They were good politically. They were good socially. They were a very secular population. They, you know, had all these progressive reforms going back to the early 20th century. And I'm still looking for this big red flag about Uruguay. We sort of were inclined to Europe, but you know, Europe is coming apart at the seams. And as I said before, especially my French, my wife's French was better. I studied French in college and high school, but I just have a hard time with French. I can't understand spoken French. And I think I would always have a lot of trouble with it. I don't remember quite why we sort of gave up on Portugal. We liked Portugal when we went and visited, but Europe was more expensive, although Portugal's very cheap. More political problems all the time there now. I just was really, and I was more fluent in Spanish than I was in French, or I didn't know any Italian at all. And so, you know, these things kept being attractive. And then when we visited it, we really liked it. And the people we met were really nice. And so it just rose to the top of the list.
Over the past few weeks, Joanna and I have been trying to get to the bottom of how on earth Trump could have won the election. Your explanation seems to me to have a lot of plausibility. If I understand you correctly, you're saying that it's largely due to the uneducated classes and to the kind of common sense that they agree on that syncs with what Trump is offering, however nonsensical that could be. Okay, and I've got and that seems plausible to me. So it's got me wondering whether that kind of explanation can possibly apply to the results of previous presidential elections. Take Obama or Clinton, for example, because the reason why I'm wondering that is because those conditions that you described about the difference between the educated and the uneducated That's been in place for some time.
Yeah, although I don't think it was as,
The internet
as
was not.
it was as deep. And when Clinton was elected in '92, what now is called woke culture on campuses was not nearly as advanced. The issue of trans hadn't come up at all. Clinton was reluctant to embrace letting homosexuals be in the military. They finally came up with don't ask, don't tell. And as I recall, Clinton was even opposed to that at first. Obama was opposed to gay marriage until Biden sort of pushed him into it. Clinton was famous for trying to reorient the Democratic Party back to the center. So I think Obama's election is interesting and hard to explain. But the country was in crisis at the time. You know, he was running in the fall when the economic crisis had broken out. And I think that had a huge amount to do with it. And then he portrayed himself, he did a really effective job of appearing to be on the left, to the left, with his hope and change rhetoric, and appearing to be very centrist by his rhetoric about we're not a red and blue America, we're not a black and white America, we're one America, and so forth. And so I had some relatives and friends who had a lot of racist views who voted for Obama. It was almost, this is a safe black person to vote for, you know, and by voting for him, then I don't have to feel, then nobody can say I'm a racist because I voted for Obama. And I mean, he was a very interesting and unique character. McCain ran against him, but McCain had been a pretty popular guy. You know, there was a famous ad during that campaign where they showed Obama saying, you know, if we keep talking about the economy, we're going to lose. He was actually quoting McCain, but Romney took this clip as if this was Obama's viewpoint. But I think it is what buried McCain. I don't think Obama could have won 4 years earlier or 4 years later without that economic crisis coloring everything. And at this, not only did the economic crisis collapse and it seemed like the big banks and things associated with Republicans were at fault, but the Iraq War had gone bad and become very unpopular. And McCain was essentially a war hawk. And so he was sort of running against the failed war and running against the failed economy. And those two things together, I think, made it possible. What was startling was he got elected and it generated a huge outpouring of racist crap. You know, threats against his life, people exchanging cartoons showing the Obamas as gorillas, and, you know, it was amazing how much racism surged up from the swamp because he was president, which was surprising because it felt like this moment of, wow, we're really at a major point of transcending the nation's racism. We have this intelligent, thoughtful, pretty progressive black president, and instead all this racist stuff comes out and he gets succeeded by Donald Trump, of all people. I don't think anybody on the night of Obama's election, nobody would have predicted the Trump phenomenon.
I once considered moving to Costa Rica in retirement.
Mhm.
And so we went down there and we met a lot of expats. As far as we know, none of those people had applied for citizenship. And I don't know if you can get dual citizenship, but what are the advantages of going all the way to becoming a full-fledged citizen?
Well, I'd become a citizen, you know, then I'd be able to vote. There's not huge advantages. I mean, one of the things in Uruguay is you go there 2 days after I landed, my attorney took me down to the office and I applied for permanent resident status. And within a week or two, I got this Uruguayan ID and it says on it, I'm applying for permanent residence. Right. It gives me essentially all the rights of a permanent resident. So from day one, I had all the rights of a permanent resident. In a year, I'll get the final official document. It'll take about 5 years to get citizenship. And then it just seems to me there'll be a few things that I can do that I can't do now. I'd like to travel on a Uruguayan passport. If it weren't a real big hassle and costly and everything else, I would renounce my US citizenship at that point, but I probably won't because it's a hassle to do. Yeah, you have dual. My wife was a dual citizen of Peru and the United States. And my daughter, because her mother was Peruvian, was able to get a Peruvian passport. So my daughter is a dual citizen of Peru and United States. My brother's wife is, my younger brother's wife is of Irish descent, and she's got an Irish passport. They're figuring if they ever have to flee the country, decide they're going to become expats, they're going to go to Ireland because she can get practically immediate citizenship, and you're inside the EU, and they speak English, sort of.
Jeff, we've got one more question that we have time for. The line. This is from Lori, and I think in the larger context, this might be related to just kind of future outlook for the world and for Uruguay in particular about climate change. But the specific question is, what is the current situation with drought and its effect on clean drinking water there? Are there any fears for it going forward?
Well, in terms of the global things, you all should, just as an option, sign up for Musk's missions to Mars. That's the next level of being an expat. They had a big drought last year and the year before that really took a chunk out of their economy. This poor responsible, moderate conservative government that was in power, that was actually a pretty decent government, got hit by the pandemic and then by this drought, and it made it very difficult for them to pursue any agenda or they managed to get the economy sort of through it anyway. And I don't know what the sources of this drought are exactly. I assume it has some connections to global warming, but it's a concern. And so the water supply of Montevideo got impacted to the point where they were having to tap water that they don't usually do, and it had a big saline content. And it got to the point where it really wasn't drinkable. And that lasted there was about a month where they were just, people were really pretty desperate because they could wash and stuff in this water, but it was safe to drink, but it was, it was like drinking seawater. Not quite that bad, but that was the direction that was going. So I don't know what they're working on some new water projects, including desalinization plant. So they have plans for addressing their water issues, but it is an issue. This is related to political crisis. I used a really interesting book in my classes a few years back of a guy who was really alarmed about global warming's political impact. He says, what global warming is doing? It's creating desertification. It's creating weird weather patterns. It's making life difficult to live or unlivable in major places. And that's creating migrations. So people are fleeing unlivable places that are being impacted by global warming. And then that's creating political crises in the countries that they're flying to, that they're moving to. And that's only going to get worse and worse. And it then creates these radical right-wing anti-immigrant movements. And so global warming is having this sort of direct chain of events that's leading to political crises around the world. And I think that's true. It's not the main cause, I think, but there's a significant part of the migration into the United States across the southern border that's coming from the impact of global warming in southern Mexico and Central America and so forth, along with all the other issues that are driving migrants. Oh, that was a nice quote I came across. As far as people moving to other countries, if you're poor and you move to another country, you're a migrant. If you're a little richer, you're an immigrant. And if you're richer yet, you're an expat.
All right, Jeff, I know we've taken up way too much of your time today. We love hearing from you. We have one more question that is excitedly coming in for us. Yeah, we'll keep this concise because we're having a great time.
Agree that Trump is the useful idiot, and the
Or an unuseful idiot.
but the destruction of democratic institutions, which he's going to systematically enact, and the henchmen and all the other nefarious things that are going on as we speak. Do you see this fascist ship riding anytime soon? When a country dissents, it takes many, many years, obviously, to have a democratic.
You know, I first started doing these post-election post-mortems here. I used to say, you know, this was long before Trump, this is 8 or 10 years before Trump. I said, you know, the Republican Party has become crazy. But the public hasn't noticed yet because they're slow, and it's the alternative. And so if they don't like the Democrats, they vote for the Republicans, assuming the Republicans are sort of like they used to be, and they're not anymore. But pretty soon the public is going to catch up, and they're going to run away from the Republican Party. Instead, it's gotten more and more popular, more and more successful politically. And so I finally started giving talks about the American electorate and not the Republican Party. Successful populists tend to contaminate the political system for a couple of generations. Argentina is still deeply divided between Peronists and anti-Peronists. The previous government to the crazy libertarian who's there now was a Peronist government, and the government before that was an anti-Peronist government. Venezuela is going to be divided between Chavistas and anti-Chavistas for the next 50 years. Whatever happens to the Maduro regime, if it falls and another government comes in, they're going to be battling like that. Nicaragua is going to be divided between the Ortegaistas and the anti-Ortegaistas forever. And so this kind of radical populism doesn't go away easily. And it has to be defeated in elections over and over and over before, and it tends not to be defeated. I mean, they overthrew Perón with a military coup in 1955. And it wasn't until 1983 that they were able to hold an election where the Peronists wouldn't win. And so they kept having military coups to block the return of Perón until the military finally gave up and said, okay, you can come back. And then it was such a disaster that they had an even worse military coup. So I think we're in for a rough stretch for a long time, whether or not Trump is in power. I don't quite know who the successor is. I think Donald Trump Jr. is trying to position himself as the heir. But he's such a moron. But Trump is a moron. I mean, that's the thing about Trump is easily the stupidest, most ignorant public figure in the history of the world, not just the United States. He doesn't know anything about anything. And if you tell him something, he parrots it back without understanding and gets it half wrong. And it's just unbelievable. You ask him anything about anything, he in addition to spouting lies, when he's not spouting lies, he spouts just utter nonsense like this. Oh, well, they're saying that in 400 years, the seas will rise 1/8 of an inch, but the good news is it'll give us more beachfront property. What the hell is going through his mind to say such a thing? So,
at least now we know what groceries are.
yeah, we know what groceries are. He invented that word, you know.
Yeah.
Well, do you like the Old Testament or the New Testament better? Was the next question. He said, yeah, well, I kind of like them both, you know. That and citing Corinthians 1 and Corinthians 2. But he's a deeply religious man. Didn't you know? That's why all the evangelical, I mean, that's the other bizarre thing that's gone on. When Clinton was under attack and so forth, and before and after, evangelical Christians were insistent that the most important characteristic of a politician was moral character. And now they're saying, well, you know, God makes use of really bad people to serve holy purposes. And Trump is a mess morally, but he's been sent by God, nevertheless, to rescue us from the satanic secularists. I mean, it's just crazy, the stuff that evangelical Christians say about Trump and the way they've accepted. He's immoral about everything. You know, he's a serial adulterer. He's a serial liar. He's completely dishonest in business. He's personally corrupt. He's full up to here with conflict of interest with respect to his businesses while he's in president. There's no aspect of morality that I can think of that he's in higher than the bottom 10th percentile. Yeah, he's selling perfume now.
He loves his daughter.
Yeah, he wants to date her.
Oh boy.
Oh, and then and these appointments, he appointed Jared's father to be ambassador to France. Jared's father went to prison because of stock frauds and so forth. He got ratted out by his brother, right? And so Jared's father hired a prostitute to seduce his brother and then create films about it to send to his brother's wife to blackmail him into not exposing his corruption. And he went to jail for all of this. Chris Christie sent him to jail, actually. That's why Chris Christie and Jared didn't get along at all, because Chris Christie. Trump pardoned this guy at the end of his previous term to let him out of jail. And now he's appointed, he appointed Carrie Lake, head of the Voice of America, to spread truth around the world. I mean, you can't make up an appointment like that. I heard that's why Julia, what's her name, Dreyfus gave up Vice because reality had become so much more preposterous and cynical than her TV show.